Who knows?
Yeah.
But there's still very much the threat of a trade war.
Canada is shifting its oil exports to China after Trump hit it with heavy tariffs, igniting a trade war that's spiraling out of control.
Recently, when U.S. President Donald Trump imposed and then suspended tariffs on all Canadian products,
Now, instead of crippling Canada, the U.S. is facing an energy crisis, while China secures a massive long-term oil supply. The balance of power in global oil trade is shifting fast.
Middle East fracking is a controversial topic, but Canada's shale oil fields could provide a boom to our energy sector.
It all started in February 2025, when Donald Trump pulled the trigger on a 25% tariff on all Canadian imports and slapped an additional 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. The reason? He claims it's all about illegal immigration and fentanyl trafficking, but the reality is, this just sent shockwaves through Canada's economy.
in the face of Trump's madness, the EU stands with Canada now. There is no reason why EU membership should be off the table.
And Canada wasn't about to just sit back and take it. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau fired back with his own 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods. And he wasn't playing small. This list included beer, wine, bourbon, fruits, clothing, appliances. Things that hit everyday Americans where it hurts. But it doesn't stop there. Canada announced plans to expand those tariffs to $125 billion after 21 days of consultation.
This is a moment for all of us to continue to stand together, and as friends and partners, that's exactly what we will always do.
But wait, there's more. After some heated negotiations, both countries paused the tariffs for 30 days to figure out their next move. But let's be real. The uncertainty is massive. This isn't just some minor trade dispute. We're talking about Canada's entire oil industry, which sends a staggering 4 million barrels of crude oil per day to the U.S. That's 81% of Canada's total oil exports. And that once rock-solid relationship? Yeah, it's cracking fast.
There's a lot of self-reflection in Canada about how much this nation relies on exports to the United States for a variety of different ways. And it caused a lot of self-reflection within the country about trading within Canada.
Because here's the twist. Canada isn't waiting around for the U.S. to decide its fate. Instead, it's pivoting to China, Japan, and South Korea. And if that shift really takes hold, it could rewrite the entire energy game between North America and Asia. Now, if we're talking oil powerhouses, Canada's no lightweight. It's actually the fourth largest oil producer in the world, cranking out 5.76 million barrels per day, making up 6% of global oil production. But let's compare that to the big players. The US dominates with 12.91 million barrels per day, a whopping 22% of the world's output. Saudi Arabia? It's sitting at 11.13 million barrels per day, holding 11% of the global share. Russia isn't far behind at 10.75 million barrels per day, also 11% of the world's production. And then there's China, producing 5.26 million barrels per day, about 5% of global output. But what really makes Canada a force is its reserves. A mind-blowing 180 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, ranking third in the world. And most of that? Locked in Alberta's oil sands. Canada's always been America's go-to supplier, with 98% of its oil exports going to the US before 2024. But that's quickly changing, and China is grabbing a bigger share than ever.
We will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again.
And that brings us to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, Canada's golden ticket to breaking free from US dependence. This isn't just any pipeline, it's a $34 billion mega project that finally went live in May 2024. And its impact? Huge. It tripled crude oil flow from Alberta to Canada's Pacific coast, boosting capacity to 890,000 barrels per day. Here's why this matters. Right now, the pipeline is running at about 80% capacity, but that number is expected to rise fast, especially if Trump actually goes through with the tariffs. That means instead of relying on U.S. refineries, Canada can now ship its oil straight to Asia.
Other nations, and the concern is obviously principally China, have tried to access the American market by bringing goods and services into Canada and then taking advantage of existing trade relationships, which Mr. Trump seems to be.
And guess who's taking full advantage? China. China is already buying 50% of the crude exports from the pipeline, making it a major player in Canada's oil future. And it's not just about volume. China's refiners are stepping in aggressively. Take Rongsheng Petrochemical, for example. This Chinese oil refining giant isn't just buying Canadian oil, it's processing 800,000 barrels per day, making it a key player in the shift away from U.S. buyers. And it's not stopping there. Since May 2024, China has already purchased $2 billion worth of Canadian crude. And it's not just China. Japan, South Korea, and Brunei have also secured major shipments of Canadian crude, ensuring that Asia becomes Canada's second home for oil exports. Instead of scrambling to fix relations, Canada is rethinking its entire economic reliance on the U.S. This isn't just about oil anymore. It's about who Canada does business with long term. And now, Canada is looking at China and the European Union, EU, as serious trade alternatives.
Americans are benevolently ignorant of Canada, whereas Canadians are malevolently knowledgeable about the United States.
And here's where things start getting ugly. Because if Trump actually enforces these tariffs, the U.S. economy takes a serious hit too. Economists are already warning that these tariffs could increase consumer prices across North America. And let's not forget, entire industries in the U.S. rely on Canadian materials, especially automotive and steel production. If Canada stops sending resources at the same rate, these industries could see massive job losses. It's like shooting yourself in the foot. The U.S. is trying to punish Canada, but they might just tank their own supply chains in the process.
The recent musings by President Trump has caused an upsurge in Canadian nationalism, which is not part of the Canadian nature that much. People waving the flag more.
And now, because of all this tension, Canadian nationalism is surging like never before. Trump's 51st state proposal, where he straight up suggested that Canada should just become part of the U.S., well, that backfired in a big way. Instead of making Canadians reconsider their independence, it did the exact opposite. Canadians are rallying behind Buy Canadian movements, grocery stores are promoting domestic products, and more businesses are shifting away from U.S. imports. This whole thing, it's actually pushing Canada toward economic self-sufficiency faster than anyone expected. And the U.S. might have pushed Canada right into Europe's arms. Some politicians and media outlets are seriously considering stronger trade ties with the EU. And they're not just talking about it. They're throwing out some wild ideas, including Canada actually joining the EU as its 28th member. Sounds crazy? Maybe. But EU officials have already said it's not impossible.
And it's not only the Toronto Star. The Economist has been pondering why Canada should join the EU. Europe needs space and resources. Canada needs people. Let's deal.
Strengthening the Canada-EU trade deal, CETA. Right now, 98% of tariffs between Canada and the EU are already removed, making Europe a solid alternative trade partner, boosting exports to Europe to reduce dependency on U.S. markets altogether. So now Canada has backup plans, and they don't involve the U.S.
Would Canada be better as the 28 EU member state or the US be first?
All right, the voice that you heard there at the very end, that was our correspondent Jack Perrick. He joins me from Brussels, and Canadian political commentator Sean Mallon is also with us from Toronto.
And here's where it gets even messier. Because at a December 2024 Mar-a-Lago meeting, Trump didn't just suggest Canada should be the 51st U.S. state. He actually called Trudeau Governor of Canada. Imagine how that went over. Canadians were already furious over the tariffs, And now Trump is straight up mocking their sovereignty. That did not sit well. And honestly, it was never going to happen anyway. Only 15% of Canadians support the idea of joining the US, and for good reason. Canada was literally formed in 1867 to avoid US annexation, and if anything, Trump's actions have made Canadians even more determined to stay independent. The rise of Canadian nationalism just makes this idea even less realistic than ever.
Consider it. You should know that, not to bore you with Canadian history, but this nation was formed in 1867 largely to avoid becoming annexed by the United States. So it's an integral part of Canadian identity to be not American.
And here's where things could really blow up. Because if Canada fully shifts its oil exports away from the US, the American energy sector takes a massive hit. Canada's oil exports are the backbone of US refineries, and without them, gas prices could soar past $7 to $9 per gallon. And the worst part? There's no easy backup plan. US refineries are built specifically for Canadian heavy crude. That means finding a replacement won't just be expensive, it'll be a logistical nightmare. OPEC and Venezuela? Yeah, they could be alternatives, but they're unstable and unreliable. The US can't afford to depend on them completely. And let's not forget, Trump isn't just making economic threats, he's also pushing false narratives. He claimed that the US subsidizes Canada, but that's completely false. Economists debunked it, saying the trade deficit is driven by market forces, not government handouts. Then, he said, US banks aren't allowed to operate in Canada, which is also flat out wrong. In reality, 16 major US banks hold $13 billion in Canadian assets, and banks like JPMorgan Chase and Wells Fargo have been operating in Canada for over a century. But here's the real winner in all of this: China. If Canada permanently shifts its oil exports, China secures a long-term crude oil supply at a time when it's trying to move away from OPEC dependence. That's a huge strategic win for Beijing and a massive loss for the US. Now, with all this chaos, what happens next? And with this trade war shaking up the global oil game, the question remains: will the US recover, or has Canada already moved on? Subscribe for more deep dives into the biggest geopolitical shifts.